Well, hello again from Signal Iduna Park. Yeah, and I've got myself a tremendous vantage for this video from up here on the gantry. Now, it doesn't really feel like the time, the place, nor the mood for any of my fairly obvious RV pet jokes. I'm going to make one. Nonetheless, and after tonight's 2-0 defeat, it does feel like Newcastle are about to bid RV to the Champions League. Yeah, you aren't laughing, are you? Now, currently, Milan are beating PSG 2-1. We're going to have to revisit that full-time result at the end of this video because that does have a significant bearing on what Newcastle need to do in the remaining two matches. There's also some significant injury news from tonight, and we'll do my merit stars, even though it probably doesn't really feel like the performance for it. I do think there was one or two who do deserve mention because Newcastle weren't terrible tonight. Now, there's the link to my Daily Mail match report in the description below. And this is the problem I've got. I've called Dortmund streetwise and I've called Newcastle naive. But what feels uncomfortable is that Newcastle aren't naive. Newcastle weren't naive on Saturday when I was comparing them to Atletico Madrid again, and you know the dark arts and how wily they were and how they play the clock at the right time, they play the opposition. They weren't naive then. It almost feels like there are two different teams now. There's the Premier League and there's the Champions League side. And like I say, Newcastle weren't awful tonight. Dortmund scored the 2 goals at times when I thought Newcastle were playing relatively well, and we'll come to the chances which they missed. And if Newcastle emerged with a draw tonight, I wouldn't have been at all surprised. If Joe Linton scores the header, equally if they go on and win it, I wouldn't have been surprised. Like I said, I'm not having a go at them or criticising them or saying they were awful, because they were still in the game when Dortmund go and get the second goal there. But is it the same team who we've seen in the Premier League and in the League Cup the last couple? No, it isn't. There isn't that same intensity, that same conviction about a lot of what they do. And I'm not going to use injuries as an excuse. Yes, they are depleted. Yes, is it having an impact? Of course it is. But they were depleted on Saturday against Arsenal. They were brilliant. They were depleted 7 days ago down at Manchester United in the League Cup, and they were brilliant. So why can't they then come here and be brilliant? Why can't they be brilliant 2 weeks ago at home to Dortmund? They weren't in those games. And we've just spoken to Eddie Howe downstairs, and he said as much himself. He said if the best version of Newcastle presents itself, they probably win there tonight. And I really believe that. You know, we're getting a little bit carried away with Dortmund. Yes, they've looked more like a Champions League team than Newcastle, but I honestly don't think they're a better team than Newcastle. If you go player for player in what they do week in, week out, in terms of how they'll be set up in the Bundesliga and what they're able to do, you know, they're beaten 4-0 by Bayern Munich here on Saturday, don't forget. So I just think it's a huge frustration for Eddie Howe and for supporters and even for observers like me that in 3 of the 4 Champions League games, Paris Saint-Germain apart, we haven't seen the real Newcastle. We've seen this lesser version. Now, Eddie said here tonight, we spoke to him, of course, last night on the eve of the game, the pre-match press conference, you wanted Newcastle to come in and control the atmosphere, control the crowd. Well, they couldn't even really control the ball during the early sort of 5 or 10 minutes. I thought it really set the tone for what at times was a sloppy display early on. I thought they were lucky to sort of stay in the game. Nick Pope made a couple of good saves when Dortmund's finishing was poor. They then go and concede just at a time where I thought that they'd finally found a little bit of steady ground. And the goal is such an uncharacteristic concession. How often do you see that from Newcastle? Repeatedly, they were given the chance to clear the ball, and every time they just refused. Now, Lewis Hall, I noticed, was getting a little bit of stick for his part, and I think that's harsh. Okay, maybe he can be a little bit stronger in the initial challenge, but then he recovers and he blocks the shot, and it's actually a bit of a scruffy cross from Marcel Sabitzer. Fulkrug turns it in with the only actual convincing act of the entire passage. Newcastle are 1-0 down. But they do have moments in the first half. Joe Linton should bring a ball down from Fabian Schär, he's in on goal. The brilliant short corner they've worked, which was tremendous between Hall and Trippier. Trippier then puts the ball in. How he doesn't find Wilson, or how Wilson doesn't anticipate, I don't know which of the two which of the two, I'm going to use the word blame's a strong word, but you know, which of the two was culpable for Newcastle not scoring from an absolutely fantastic situation. They then get to half time and it's obvious changes are needed. Anthony Gordon comes on, Lewis Hall goes off, as does Wilson. Now Wilson, quickly to jump in with the injury news, Wilson felt a tightness in his hamstring. I've just asked Eddie Howe there, what's the latest? Is he a doubt? He said it's too early to say, but there is a definite tightness there. And knowing what we know about Callum Wilson, that feels like that would be a risk going down to play him at Bournemouth on Saturday. We'll have to wait and see on that front. Anyway, Newcastle come out for the second half, and I'm sat there in the press box of Sky's where we had a great view just over my shoulder there, and I say to my colleagues, Newcastle are going to score here. I thought they came out with much more purpose, pace and purpose. They look like, I wrote in my report, they look like Premier League Newcastle finally after that sticky first half. And then they have the chance. Tino Livramento puts the ball on a plate for Joe Linton 4-5 yards from goal, where committed goal. It's a goal. We've all shouted goal, and he glances it wide. He puts it wide, and I looked at Eddie just down on the touchline, and he put his head in his hands and he walked away, and it felt at that moment hugely significant, and so it proved, to bring you in on what we do, our match reports. I'd even committed then to that being a significant miss that Newcastle would come to regret. I would have to have changed that if they then got it equalised, of course, but it just felt then in that moment like it would be a big talking point. And then he's just said down there, it proved decisive in terms of the narrative of their game. They go back to that moment. It's 1-0, but even still then, Newcastle are doing okay. Are they at the best? No, but they're doing okay. They're still in the game. And they then got a free kick with 11 minutes to go, just over my shoulder there. Kieran Trippier lines it up, and it smells as an air of anticipation, just a whiff of. I had my camera ready. I was sat next to Lee Ryder, so I've got my camera ready. I'm gonna film the away end when Newcastle equalised. I was right. There was a goal, but it was a Dortmund goal. 30 seconds later, it's a really poor free kick from Trippier. You know what I think of him. I've got him down as my player of the season so far. I have to say tonight's performance has been more in keeping how he's been in the last two. He looks like he needs a rest. It looks like something needs to change. He isn't at those levels. It's a poor free kick, and Dortmund clear, and Tino Livramento was left in a 2-1 situation. Now, what I want to pick up on here is, even by the time it's 2-1, even by the time Julian Brand scores the goal that ends the game, it's still 2-1. Where were Newcastle's players? One thing I would never level at them is a lack of desire, work rate, commitment, all the rest of it. I thought they were poor in that moment. I thought too many of them ambled back. Would it have made a difference? Probably not. But nonetheless, that just captured a little something about Newcastle tonight when too many of their players weren't at it. That's 2-0. And it's game over, and it could well be, Champions League over for Newcastle. But again, that frustration is that I think they're good enough, and I mean this is a compliment. I'm not going to make excuses for them, because I think they're good enough to come out of this group, as they showed against Paris Saint-Germain. And the question I asked of Eddie afterwards was, why aren't you replicating what you do domestically in the Champions League? And he gave an honest answer, honest in that he said, I don't know, I'm trying to work that out, because that is a different team. We've seen that tonight, a different team we saw Milan, a different team we saw last time against Dortmund. Now the Merit Stars, 3, we're going to give them, even in defeat. Seems like Newcastle win or play well most weeks at the moment, but not tonight. But there was one standout performer. I thought that was Tino Livramento. I didn't think it worked in the first half on the right wing, I must admit. As much as he gave it his all, I honestly think he's better, because he's got such a good engine, and we saw down at Man U last week, he's better with the play and open grass in front of him, because he wants to drive into it, and he can drive into it. On the right wing there in the first half, I thought he was a little bit lost at times, but nonetheless in the second half, I thought he was the main reason why Newcastle showed improvement with that energy and drive, down the right. 2 stars has got to go to Nick Pope, almost by default really, because of 2 or 3 saves he made, which meant that by the time it got to that, those closing stages, it still only was 1 goal. 2 stars for Nick Pope, and the 1 star I think probably goes to Anthony Gordon, just for what he did in the second half. He came on, I've used that phrase, a bit of pace and purpose, and it was no coincidence with Gordon on the pitch that Newcastle were improved. Should Eddie have started Gordon? Well, what he's just said to us is he wanted to give himself some options off the bench. He wanted to have Almiron and Gordon to come on. And, as I say, it was fine-ish margins on a different night. Joe Linton puts that in. It's looking like Eddie's got it completely right. So I'm not going to criticise him for not starting Gordon, especially when we don't know the date, or our players entering, the red zone, which I've mentioned Trippier there as not being at it. And again, I'm not going to go through the team and say they were terrible, but when Newcastle's midfield doesn't perform as it should, that's when I think everything else falls down, as we've seen at the early part of the season and some other key games. Bruno tonight, I thought Bruno from the off just looked like the Bruno who's sometimes a little bit heavier, doesn't move like he should. I didn't think he was great. Sean Longstaff again didn't have one of his better nights, and when that midfield doesn't perform the way it is absolutely capable of, I think Newcastle come off it, and for me that was perhaps the reason why the team as a whole didn't function. In the news on Wilson again, that's that's a big worry for them now, especially as Alexander Isak is still out. He's training alone, by the way. We don't think he'll be ready for Bournemouth at the weekend. We'll have to wait and see. But yeah, Cantino Livramento play up front. He's done everything else the last couple of weeks. Well, guys, I said I would revisit what's happened in Milan, and they've won 2-1. Now, that leaves Newcastle bottom of the group on 4 points, but Dortmund, the leaders, are only on 7, so they can still finish in any one of the 4 positions. But the but is they go to Paris next, and if Newcastle lose in Paris and Milan beat Dortmund in Milan, which of course they are capable of doing, that would leave Newcastle out of all European competition. They could only then finish bottom of the group by virtue of the fact they could only catch Dortmund, but the head-to-head with Dortmund means they can't finish above them. So yeah, there is potential that this European adventure could be over in a couple of weeks' time, which would be a great shame. You know, I was in the square there today, mixing amongst lots of you guys. So many of you came up to me and said you watch the channel, you really enjoy it, you read the stuff, and you know that's great to hear. I really do appreciate that. And I have to say the atmosphere down there was brilliant. I just stood on the side and took it all in. It was quite something. And those of you guys I spoke to, I said 2 things. I said, I wish I had what was in your hand, which was invariably a pint of beer. But as I said last night, you know, super professional. I haven't had a beer yet. I will do soon. And the other thing was, you just hope that, be it finishing in the top 2 or 3rd, and at the time when I was talking to you guys, I was saying I think it's probably more likely. You just hope the European adventure continues into Europe. So I have to say, what I saw and what I've seen over the last 24 hours, the Newcastle supporters' behaviour has been absolutely exemplary. And that in the square today, I was talking to a local who said, it never happens. All the time they've had Champions League visitors and big games here, they've never booked out the square like that and had a DJ, a stand, music, good fun. It was so funny to see. The offices which surrounded, there wasn't much work being done. The locals were stood at their office window just watching down on the party below. Sadly for you guys, from a Newcastle perspective, that probably was the highlight of the day. But you know, nonetheless, it's been another good trip. It's been, for us guys as journalists, you know, it's a good story. There's been plenty to go at. Another intriguing game, intriguing from your perspective for the wrong reasons, and that I think it's fascinating how you can go from that performance on Saturday. And yet there are so many, I'll come back to this to go full circle, there are so many mitigating factors, but I don't want to give a team and a manager I think so much of excuses, and that's exactly what Eddie's just said to us downstairs. So yeah, don't shoot me, I'm just repeating what he said. So yeah guys, again, thank you so much for watching these last couple of days. Please hit like, subscribe and comment. Please click on the links below, and I'll be back on Friday after we've spoken to Eddie, looking ahead to that trip down to Bournemouth. Okay, take care tonight, out and about in Dortmund and Dusseldorf, and safe travels too. See you soon. Bye bye. Well, actually, I say goodbye. I've still got time for one last. Auf Wiedersehen.